Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the End of the World Reading Club. This is the second End of the World Reading Club that we're doing as part of Cosmere Festival 2020. As ever, let me know in the comments if you can hear me and see me fine. Hopefully everything's working out there in live streaming land. So today we're going to be talking about this book, Ice, by Kavan. I shall put that on the screen so you know what we're talking about. We're going to be doing this for about an hour. But before we kick off, I just want to thank all of you for tuning in and enjoying this content as part of Cosmere Festival 2020. This is the final day of our small online festival that we've been running for the past 10 days. We've got 2 more events to come at the end of the day, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about those at the end of this video. We hope you've managed to tune in or attend something as part of the festival and have come with us on our journey, our year-long journey for the end of the world. We're going to do one more book club about the end of the world, and then I think we might do something else. I think I've read enough about the end of the world for one lifetime, and I expect you probably have done as well. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this little book in a minute. And I shall start, as I usually do, with a bit of an overview of the book and what we're going to talk about, and what some of the structures of it are. So there are, of course, spoiler warnings for this book if you've not read it. It's not a book I'd heard of until I bought it this year, even though it is a Penguin classic in this edition. So it might well be that you haven't read it or heard of it either. I don't think I can spoil this book really for you because I'm not entirely sure that the plot and the characters are the point. This is a personal experience you can go on, but if you are sensitive to spoilers, then you really can go away and maybe watch this on catch up and leave your comments on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook channel of what you think of it. So as ever, let me know if you're out there. Any comments that come in, I'll be able to see, and you can respond to the conversation. I'll put them on the screen, and then we can build a bit of a dialogue about this book, because I think there's an absolutely massive amount and about 1 million interpretations which we can get to as we go. I've got my notes just here to the side, so I'm going to be doing a little bit of flicking back and forth if you're not sure what's going on. But let's kick off. So firstly, let's start with a content warning. There's some really difficult stuff in this book. I think we'll come on to that as we talk about what happens in it. But it's important to note that at least one character in the story goes through some quite traumatic experiences at the hands of men, and as struggling with lots of things that are going on to do with their mental health. So if you're sensitive to those things, or if you're going to be having some issues with talking about those kind of things, then maybe this isn't the stream for you. I'm not going to go too much into any detail, particularly as it's only 11:30 on a Sunday morning. But just so you're aware, we are going to get into some slightly deeper stuff than we maybe have done in any video since we talked about Black Leopard, Red Wolf. So this book, as you say, is a Penguin classic, and it was published originally in 1967, the year before the author died. And it was it's the most popular book that she wrote. It's the one that's probably stood the test of time in terms of its continuing to be talked about to this day. As I mentioned before, it's not one that I'd ever heard of. And then when I was doing my kind of big buying frenzy in August, when I bought 10 plus books in a month, this one stood out to me because I was thinking about books about the end of the world. And the blurb description was what drew me in. I didn't do a lot of other research, but it was definitely the blurb that attracted my attention. So I'm just going to start by reading this because it's interesting to compare this to actually what the story is, I think. No sun, no shadows, no life, a dead cold. No one knows why the ice has come, and no one can stop it. Every day it creeps further across the earth, covering the land in snow and freezing everything in its path. Through this bleached, devastated world, one man pursues a sylph-like, silver-haired girl he loves as she keeps running away from her husband, away from the sinister warden who seeks to control her, away from him. So it seemed to me that this might be something like The Road, if it was a chase movie, I suppose, or kind of had maybe a Mad Max on ice vibe. So I went into it incredibly naive about the experience I was going to get coming out. And I've picked out a quote to kick us off, which I think sets the tone for how this story goes. And that is, the hallucination of one moment did not fit the reality of the next. This is an absolutely mind-boggling, mind-bending story. I think in some ways very 1960s, but also has got a lot of relevance for today, and it's probably gained relevance in the way that it thinks about the world in the time since then. Excuse me. So, before we get into this book and why it's so mind-bending, who wrote it? The author wasn't born Anna Kavan. She was born Helen Woods. And the name Anna Kavan was actually a character name in a couple of semi-loosely autobiographical novels that she wrote. And then she started using it as her own name and actually changed her name legally to be Anna Kavan. So she obviously really identified with that. She was British, but born in Cannes in 1901. Her parents were kind of rich and had land in Northumberland. Had a miserable childhood, mostly at boarding schools that she hated, particularly kind of Victorian-style boarding schools. Her father took his own life when she was 10, and not that long afterwards, she married very young to a man who I don't think was very nice. It was only 2 years, and then she returned to England, and then eventually married again, and had a tennis injury. That's how the story goes, and was prescribed something that was legal at the time and very experimental, I suppose, heroin for the pain. And a bit like the opioid crisis today, heroin got its claws into her and she became an addict. At this time, she was also hanging around with a load of racing drivers in the south of France. So she was having a kind of a great time, but also a really miserable time. And she, this is kind of the rest of her life really is governed by those early experiences, by the two men she'd married and in two not very pleasant marriages by all accounts, and the addiction that she had as a constant companion for the rest of her life. And there's a quote from the time that she put in her diary about heroin making one's eyes beautiful and just watching herself in the mirror for a long time and just kind of being sucked into self-reflection. And I think that's something we'll also come on to talk about. And she described her own nature as hopeless, and her writing all the way through from the very early kind of more realist writing was about female personality type of the unloved girl who's going to become an unhappy woman, and always very pale and cold, suspicious, and like leave me alone is the motto. She was a very slight, pale woman herself, and the girl character, we'll talk about the characters in a minute in this story, can be seen in that context as a self-portrait. And when the Second World War broke out, she travelled. She went to Norway, she went to New Zealand, she went to Bali, and a snowbound New York. And I think we'll talk a bit about the world of ice being inspired by these journeys. A lot of time on ships, a lot of time in wintry or interesting climates. When she came back to London, she worked with traumatized soldiers, which she wrote about in several stories, and I think she wrote about in Ice. But mostly, people who've written about her work identify that her preoccupations are opioid addiction, extreme weather, female oppression, and psychopathology. So, and these are all strands that come together in this story. So let's talk a bit about the story. I don't think I can really justify a précis of this story because it is so odd. But the general plot, as the blurb tends to suggest, is that there is a world which is under threat of ice. The world is under threat of ice completely taking over the world. This is a climate emergency. Obviously, this is written in the 1960s when nobody's really thinking about climate change in a way that we do today. And in fact, there had been this fad for talking about a new mini ice age after the Second World War. So it might be tipping a little bit into some of those ideas that were in society at the time, potentially. The story is told by a narrator. He goes unnamed, who is essentially following a woman around the world. As this ice descends and this glacier is taking over the whole planet, he's chasing a woman. He's chasing a woman that he's obsessed with. And when he gets her, he doesn't necessarily want her anymore, but he just travels from place to place to get there. And there's an incredibly evocative story beginning here, which is a bit like a mystery. Our narrator is in a incredibly dangerous, snowy environment, trying to get to the house where this woman and her husband live. They have a really odd experience there. He kind of goes away, he's come back. She disappears, and he sets himself on a mission to track her down because she's gone missing. And there's a suspicion that people think that he might have done her in. And so part of it might be just about proving that she's still alive. The setting in the beginning, I think probably for this one, we're going to mash the story and the world together because I think they go together in the telling of this story. The story seems to begin in somewhere that could be Britain, and perhaps northern Britain. And then it moves to somewhere overseas, which could be somewhere in Scandinavia, essentially. That's kind of what all the hints are, again, unnamed, but a kind of maybe Second World War defeated Norway or Denmark, where everything's been shelled out. And he finds the girl there, but she is under the control. She's almost like a prisoner of a character called the Warden. The Warden eventually takes her away. He follows. She gets away. He finds her again. He leaves her alone. Then the Warden wants her again, so he wants her again. And then eventually they end up together, kind of. So it's like a travel story where it's a kind of pursuit or like a tracking down. So in some ways, structurally, it's like a detective story. He sees himself as a kind of like a PI doing undercover work, trying to track this woman down in unfriendly places. And that makes it sound very conventional, but the story is not told in that way. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, it's hallucinatory, a word I can't say. But the action is continually flitting between what he's doing and what he's seeing and what the narrator is imagining. So before we get into a bit more of that, let's talk about the characters. I realise that I'm whizzing through all of these building blocks of the story because I think in some ways they're not as important as what the story's about. And that's what I want to dedicate most of this hour to talking about. If you read the book and you've got comments about it and what you think it's about, start prepping them for the comments, and you can put them in the queue so that I can drop them in when we get to those bits in my notes, I suppose. So the characters. We've got three main characters in this story. We have the narrator, who is a man of unknown age, but he has had some military experience, and possibly, to my mind, inspired by some of those veterans that the author met at the end of the Second World War. He's dealing with trauma. He's probably got what we would call now PTSD, and his whole worldview has become infused by trauma, by fantasy. He might even have a split personality. At one point, he hears people talking about him as maybe having schizophrenia. So our main narrator is an incredibly unreliable and unlikable character. He's got horrendous views about women. He's got horrendous views about other people. And we see this whole world through this kind of prism of his mind. Sometimes it's incredibly lucid and he's describing things he's doing. Sometimes he seems to be describing things which he's imagining are happening whilst something else is actually going on, or he's imagining potential futures, and these are things that are driving him on his journey. We also have the female character, this character who is described as the girl, and she's described as the girl mostly by, or exclusively by, our male narrator, but she's portrayed the whole way through as this Anna Kavan archetype of a very pale, a very shy girl who's grown up with trauma and is now utterly unable to cope with the world because of the life that she's had. We have our third main character, which is the warden. And the warden and the narrator have an incredibly weird dynamic. The narrator is in awe of the warden. He's another kind of military leader, and he's a bit like a mercenary, or somebody that is keeping ahead of the ice by moving to the next theatre of war. I can't really tell if he's any good at being a general of any kind, but he keeps going and he keeps surviving, and he's always in a position of authority and power. So our narrator looks up to this character. He looks up to him because he's somebody in authority, of power, and he sees something of himself in him. There's a reading here which suggests that they might be the same character, and the narrator is having trouble disassociating one from the other. That's not necessarily what the story does, but it's a reading that I think I've got some sympathy with. The warden, though, we don't really get much of a sense of what he's about, and actually his character shifts really dramatically from moment to moment. What we're getting is the narrator's vision of a character. We're not getting a character on their own. In the same way that I think with the girl, we're getting the narrator's version of the girl. We're not getting any agency. So this really is like a fever dream of our first character, the narrator. And then there are other people that flit in and out, and they're only really presented in relation to the narrator. So there are other characters in the story that come and go. The one that's most mysterious for me is the husband of the girl, who we meet at the beginning and then essentially disappears for the rest of the story. The husband, that first husband, the husband has got no interest of doing this kind of tracking down in the same way as the narrator has. And then there are also lots of small characters that we meet along the way, particularly in the kind of pseudo-Scandinavian countries, who are normally incredibly suspicious of foreigners and are incredibly paranoid. And the narrator variously tries to bribe, to bully, to sweet talk to get what he wants. So they're all seen as vessels for transactions rather than as people that he wants to form a relationship with. And there's some incredibly odd interludes, particularly when we get towards the latter part of the book and it moves to a more tropical environment where this gets very odd. So just to finish talking about the world, the first thing to note is that almost everywhere in there is nameless. This has got a really interesting thing for me because I've spent the whole time trying to work out where places were. And like I said, I think probably the first bit is set in England, Northern England potentially, or maybe somewhere like the Downs, somewhere quite kind of semi-rural. And then then there's this kind of like pseudo-Scandinavia, and I couldn't quite tell if all the places were supposed to be Scandinavia, or if some of them were also supposed to be maybe mainland Europe. I couldn't quite get Russia even. I couldn't quite get the geography. They're earlier on in the story, and I think thinking about ice flow, that's probably, you want to get out of there pretty quickly. So maybe it was somewhere like southern Denmark, like the North Sea kind of area. Some of the landscapes were apparently inspired by the author's time in New Zealand and New Zealand's proximity to Antarctica. So there is a whole other reading here where some of this action is in New Zealand, which has got that kind of small town England feel, I think. But yeah, it's a really interesting, it's clearly, very, very clearly Earth, but it's also an Earth that has been it's seen at a remove. It's seen as if it's like through a dream, where nothing is quite as it seems. And this is really hammered home when the narrator leaves one of our Scandinavian, I'm going to say Scandinavian, it's easier, settings, and moves to somewhere else. He spent this time in this shelled out port where there's nothing going on, and everything is just it's just like kind of post-apocalyptic war nightmare, like London after the Blitz. But when he gets back on the boat to leave, he turns around and suddenly it's a bustling, vibrant, cosmopolitan, modern city. So which one was he in? Was he in the first one, and was he in that kind of post-apocalyptic one, and then actually the other one is a vision? Or is it the other way around? And is it only when he leaves he sees something else? I'd love to know your thoughts on which what you think is true, because I was really confused. So that's kind of the book and my thoughts and my overview of what's going on in it. But as I said, I kind of wanted to focus more time on what things came out of the story for me. Now, I want to point out that this is an incredibly thin volume. It's only 182 pages in this edition, and the text is not necessarily tiny, but it's quite a dense read. Quite a lot of the reviews that I've seen either describe it as an easy read, but also a hard read. It's definitely a book that is very intense. I couldn't quite read it all in one sitting. I had to have even though it's short, I had to have quite a few periods where I looked at it. One of the first things that stood out to me was that although this is a novel that was published in the 60s, it has that vibe of the 1960s. There's also been a lot of comparisons to it with Franz Kafka, and it has that kind of Kafkaesque nature. But like all good speculative writing, it also feels incredibly contemporary to now. And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes that highlight that reality, and incredibly prescient for the UK of last night and for the whole of 2020 pretty much. Confusion was increased by a spate of new and conflicting regulations, and by the arbitrary way controls were imposed or lifted. The second quote: my impression was that they'd lost their way, did not know how to deal with the approaching danger, and hoped to keep the public in ignorance until a plan had been evolved. And this is something that I found absolutely fascinating that I wanted to talk about the kickoff that was really interesting. So the author has written this story, and we'll get into the kind of the weirdness of it a bit in these things that I want to talk about. I've already hinted that it has a lot of very strange moments. The story shifts quite dramatically between what's happening and what the narrator thinks might happen. But the other thing that really comes through is a remarkable understanding of how a society might operate in a breakdown. Now, clearly, the author had been through the Second World War and had been an adult in the Second World War, and had seen some of the ways that governments tended to control the narrative and control the story. But what happens here, what's happening in this world, is that our characters are moving through it and they don't really know what's going on. So we get the idea that there's been potentially a nuclear explosion. And what has happened is that this has had a real effect on the sun's ability to heat the planet. And very dramatically, we're moving into a nuclear winter. There's a lot of suggestions that there's a bit of a pun here that Anna Kavan's writing about a Cold War, in that the Cold War has led to an invasion by cold. I'm not entirely convinced that that is her primary preoccupation, although I can imagine there was a bit of a chuckle putting those things together. But I think actually ice has got some other connotations, which I'd love to know what you think ice means before I talk about my ideas. But what does happen in the story is that world governments know what's going on. They've got the information, and they also get drawn into a bitter fight for control of this dwindling planet and this dwindling reserves. There's a huge amount of people displaced and who are racing to move ahead of this glacier. All at the same time, governments are withholding most of the information from the populace about what's going on. The warden, our third character, he knows what's going on a lot more than anybody else because he's in a position of power. So our narrator tends to know what's going on through either weirdly kind of hinted connections, because he's been involved in the military, or through things that he manages to glean from the warden. So he's kind of in the middle of this knowledge, and then the girl is on the other end, not really knowing what's going on and just kind of drifting around. And then the rest of the world's population seem to be absolutely panicking. They're in the end times and they don't quite know what to do. Some people are just partying at the end of the world, and some of them are trying to escape. When I think about what's happened in the world this year, that idea of governments giving some information and not all the information, and about the way that huge populists deal with pandemics and with end of the world scenarios, felt really close to life in lots of ways. Obviously, we haven't had a lot of governments who've completely hidden the pandemic, but we have had governments who've tried to downplay it, or in some cases tried to argue that it's not happening or barely happening. So there's a very, I felt, kind of Orwellian cynicism about structures of power and the information they give to populace, which sits alongside this other story. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how those two things relate, or if they are slightly different things that the author's trying to talk about. So that brings us to the ice. It's called Ice, and ice is there right from the very beginning. The story begins in a snowstorm. It ends with the ice's kind of almost final victory over the planet. There's a lot of suspicion that the ice represents heroin. It represents the kind of icing of veins, maybe, or the icing of feelings and emotions. Something that the author's life story seems to suggest is that she felt that her opioid addiction was a way of controlling her depression. Another thing that she struggled with as well as her addiction, and that one was there to balance out the other. And she managed to find medical practitioners who also felt the same and kept her medicated. The story goes that when she died of heart failure. Her flat was full of enough heroin for the whole street for kind of forever. She'd just been stockpiling it because she felt that there was going to be an issue in the future. So there's a real sense for me that the ice represents a couple of things. I think ice compared to snow is interesting because snow covers everything, but ice is also reflective. Ice is also a mirror. And there's something there which is drawn through in the story for me, I think. The narrator carries a photo of the girl, which is a picture taken as a reflection in the water. It's self-reflective. Going back to the idea that when she was using heroin, she looked in the mirror and just saw herself the whole time. Ice maybe represents an icing of emotions, and the use of opioids to chill emotions, strong emotions down. But maybe it also suggests the takeover. The glaciers are no longer at the poles. They're taking everything, and the exterior world is being constricted by ice as the planet is gradually being constricted by the ice. And at the end, there's nothing. That's the end of humanity. It's a really bleak reading, but this is quite a bleak story. It's probably the bleakest story we've talked about since April, when we've been looking at end of the world and apocalyptic narratives. I also think the Blitz is in there for me, and the Second World War looms very large for me. Although this is written in the 60s, a lot of stuff had happened to the world since 1945. Her experiences going around the world on ships during the Second World War, her dealing with damaged soldiers in 1945 and kind of writing about it, so then having to process it. and those visions, especially that visions of that kind of pseudo-Scandinavian city being shelled out remains. My first mental image was those pictures of London after the Blitz. So I think that also looms very large. And there's definitely this sense of a planet that's been through a conflict and is still going through a conflict, and then the glaciers have come in. So is this the Cold War element coming in a slightly playful way? Because there's a sense here that there's talk at the beginning about the emergency, and nobody knows quite what it is. So is the emergency the ice, or is the emergency war, and the ice is a byproduct? I think there's probably an element of both there, and a comment on what we might do to the planet, or what we are doing to the planet. So the next thing I want to talk about, we're about halfway through, so please do drop some comments in if you've read the story, for any of you that are viewing out there. I want to talk about genre. And the genre is a really interesting aspect of this story. The novel actually won a prize, I think, for science fiction. It was nominated by Brian Aldiss, who admitted afterwards that he didn't think it was a science fiction story. And I think I agree. The term that's often used to describe it is slipstream fiction. And this is something that is between genres. It's not science fiction, it's not speculative fiction, it's not literary fiction, it's not fantasy. It's somewhere that is in between all of them. For me, it kind of felt quite Lynchian, or it felt like a Christopher Nolan film. There's a blending here. It's psychedelic, but not psychedelic in a really 60s way. I was looking up a bit about LSD because I wondered whether she'd encountered that when she was being treated for her mental health issues, because she was put in what they called sanatoriums at the time in Switzerland. And I'm not sure. There's no evidence either way for me whether she was treated by a doctor who was using that in the 30s and 40s. But the book was only published a year after LSD started to be kind of dropped in California. So I don't think that was necessarily something on her mind. But the genre is something that is really interesting. And I'm not necessarily somebody that's held up on genre. Cosmere is a festival that is about speculative work. And this, in some ways, for me, as a book, represents speculative work. It's clearly not in a world that is exactly our own. It's set in our future. It's not now set necessarily in our future because the world has moved on. But I think you could have made a compelling case in the 1980s, or maybe the 70s, but maybe even into the 80s, before computers really became a thing in everybody's lives, because they're not really in the story. Mobile phones aren't in the story, that it could have been a future vision. And I suppose in the future, it could be a future vision again. And if you replaced out the ice for global warming, and for humanity kind of running around the planet trying to find a safe haven and getting ahead of the consequences of their own actions, you could write this story today. And it would probably just go under that bracket of speculative fiction. I think the reason it's often talked about as slipstream is that there's that mangling of all of those genres, is those fantastical elements. And I suppose it depends how you read it. One way of reading it is that these things are kind of all happening. That sometimes there's a narrative and then it goes into a bit of a weird kind of maybe parallel world, or that's the parallel universes is a note I think I made quite early on when I was reading it. Or this is an interior experience. This is somebody who has got a lot of stuff going on in their mind, who is trying to navigate the world, and what they're experiencing is a distorted version of reality and what's going on. That's probably my favorite one for me. And what is really fascinating about that is that I don't think you get that in speculative fiction very often. There's a lot of reviews of this which call it a singular book. And I think in that way, it really is singular. you do get first-person science fiction fantasy stories where the world is weird and the world is seen to be weird and characters have weird experiences. And there's that kind of Alice in Wonderland element to it. I also made notes more than once about the girl being like the White Rabbit, and our narrator is following the White Rabbit into these kind of very odd experiences. And really, it's just a pretext to get the character from one place to another. I'm not entirely convinced by that idea, by the way, but there has that feeling for me anyway. But at the same time, it's got to be partly about PTSD and about what you do with people who have been damaged and how they then have to deal with the world. Now, this is definitely the case with the narrator. There's loads of hints about the military service. There's loads of hints about trying to deal with his own trauma. And there's moments of lucidity and self-reflection and wondering about their own identity. This isn't an entirely psychopathic character that doesn't understand what's going on. There is self-reflection that the actions that he's taking are not great. But this is maybe also reflected in the girl. The girl is presented by the narrator as somebody that has also dealt with a lot of trauma and hasn't dealt with it very well and is unfortunately living their life based on what they've had to deal with when they were younger. And that comes back to that biography of Anna Kavan, of when she was Helen and having a difficult childhood and being in abusive marriages, and having to try and deal with all of those things and mental health issues and addiction all along the way. So both the narrator and the girl are struggling to cope and are processing the world in the best way that they know how. Now, the warden isn't the same, so maybe it's worth looking at the warden and seeing what the warden represents in this story. I wonder whether the warden represents who the narrator would want to be. I mentioned before that kind of hero worship element of the warden, but the warden is always self-assured. The warden is obviously struggling to cope with the emergency and dealing with that. There's a lot of shifts in tone and in emotion for the warden. But I wonder whether the warden is also seen as this better version of the narrator and potentially the girl to some degree, although I think a much less degree for reasons we'll come on to. So I'd love to know your thoughts on those characters and the genre and how they all intertwine. It really is not like a book I've ever read before, especially in this genre. And that mixing of internal fantasy, often without pause, you'll become mid-page, mid-action, and suddenly the narrator is talking about something that they're not witnessing, and then suddenly we're back to the narrative, and that stuff hasn't happened. It was just all a thought, a fantasy, maybe even a dream. This is something that I want to propose: is this all a dream? It has a really odd dream-like function. I suppose maybe the dreamlike tone is linked to opioids. This could be presented as somebody just kind of cruising through life under the influence of opioids and trying to make best sense of what they see in front of their eyes. So that's that genre, that's the world. That's probably as back and forth and free-flowing as the narrative is in terms of my thoughts, and perhaps reflects just how much is going on in the story and that I'm still in that process of unpicking it. So let's move on to something that's even bleaker than what we've already talked about. There's a whole tradition of feminist readings of this story. And how can you not? If you've read this, then I hope you've got some thoughts on this yourself that you're happy to share in the comments or afterwards on the video in the comment section. Because this is a story, as I mentioned before, about three characters. Two men in positions of authority. They are presented the whole way through as being powerful, strong, physically, and also relentless. and then a female character who is portrayed the whole way through as weak, as controllable, as transparent, difficult to read, and almost all the way through as girl-like. And there's a reading of this story by Doris Lessing where the narrator is the father of the girl rather than a former lover, but I think I still err towards the lover side. And this story then becomes about control, about objectification, and about power. And my thought as I was reading it was that the characters represent toxic archetypes for me. The narrator is one of those kind of horrible, self-assured, violent, damaged male characters that you get in fiction. He's definitely an anti-hero who feels like he's a hero, but also has got no reserve about describing some of the violence that he wants to perpetrate towards other characters, and in particular, the girl, as he calls her. She was pale and transparent, the victim, used for my own enjoyment in dreams. And there's this thread all the way through of not only that the narrator wants to be the only one allowed to possess the girl. He's for short periods of time kind of okay with the idea that she can be with somebody else. We start the story with her being married and he's kind of put her out of his mind, but she is a dangerous obsession for him. I think here the girl represents addiction and the opioids. But that's only one level. I think there's multi-levels to how the narrator and the girl are linked. There is an element of love there, particularly by the end. And the ending is I'm not going to talk about the ending because I think if you read this, I want you to get to that at your own point and then come back and comment. Leave some comments about the ending and what you think about whether it was successful or not. But I think the girl and the narrator's relationship is an incredibly thorny one. She clearly has had feelings for him in the past at some point. I'm not quite sure what those feelings are, but there's been maybe something there, but he's clearly done something horrendous and something she can't get over. But the narrator can't let her go. And there's that archetype there then of the kind of, he's the white knight. This is talked about quite a lot, that he's seen as somebody who needs to save her, particularly with the emergency. He's the person that can lead it to safety. But also it's about control. It's about possessing somebody and having somebody there. The warden occupies a similar position. The warden is also somebody that can't bear for the girl to be with anybody else. Well, actually, that's not quite true. And we get that towards the end of the story. Perhaps more that the warden is also somebody that wants to protect the girl and is obsessed with her, but has got other preoccupations. He's maybe a part removed. And what we get from the narrator and we don't get from the warden is the fantasies. And the fantasies are almost always about the girl dying. Not necessarily at his hand, because he wants to be the white knight, but also he wants to be the person that has the say about her fate and wants to be the one that gets to choose. So it comes back to that control. The girl is a bit more difficult, I think, for me, because the girl is seen through the prism of the narrator's eyes. She is portrayed the whole way through as that kind of passive, pale, painfully shy most of the time, unknowable figure. And perhaps for me, this is the author critiquing the way that the men maybe that she's had in her life, those husbands, have struggled to see her and to understand who she is internally. Her father even maybe. And to only have that archetype of her as kind of pale, and that if you're quiet and if you're reserved, then men can become obsessed by finding out about you and being the one that then either puts their own personality on you or can fix all the problems that you're going through. And maybe this is something that she's encountered in her own life. There is lots of imagery of the girl being in rooms on her own, and then men barging in unannounced and her being prevented from leaving. This happens maybe 3 or 4 times. And the imagery all the way through is really disturbing in how she's presented, the situation she's put in. She's almost always kept captive, or she's being forced to live the lives of the men rather than what she really wants to do. And when she finally does find that space to live her own life, it doesn't last very long. So that is probably my thoughts on the story. But I kind of want it to end on what I think this book might be able to tell us about apocalypses and an apocalyptic fiction and the end of the world, and perhaps draw it in with some of the other stories that we've talked about since April, because we've now discussed, and in the festival, we've discussed a lot of end of the world narratives told by a wide variety of authors in a variety of settings. And what perhaps draws some writers to using apocalypses. Now, this is an interesting case for me, because I think the author clearly isn't writing about the end of the world as we would now, where the narrative is climate change, and climate change can be told through using other narrative devices. This is somebody writing in a period of the Cold War, and quite often end of the world in the Cold War are told through alien invasions, the red men of Mars representing the communists, or nuclear apocalypses. And there is a nuclear element to this, and that kind of idea of nuclear winter. But nuclear winters are also about explosions. They're an echo of what happened in Japan, and that kind of massive destruction. And there's an element of that massive destruction here, but it's also about a sense of a creeping sense of the planet dying. There's something quite spooky about that this was published the year before the author died. And I wonder if actually here the end of the world is personal. She clearly does want to talk about the way that societies and people function. She wants to talk about information, about control. You might suggest that the governments represent the people in her lives and the information that she's given about herself and about her condition. But also the apocalypse is an immensely internal one. It's kind of happening. It's the thing that is dictating the situation that our main characters find themselves in. And it provides a creeping sense of dread. It provides a creeping sense of dread for the world, but it doesn't provide a creeping sense of dread for the main characters, because they are in some ways, particularly the narrator and the girl, they exist in their own worlds. And that maybe links back in there finally with the addiction that the author was struggling with, or using to process or keep at bay other things. The narrator's obsession, the narrator's journey, the narrator being fixated on this idea of a girl and of a pale and girl who's having to exist in her own space. You could possibly see the narrator's obsession as the opioid, and ice as her mental health. And the obsession keeps the idea of the encroachment of the world from taking over, from completely closing off. It's an escape mechanism. And very early on, the girl escapes from the snowstorm and goes somewhere else. And the narrator is constantly escaping one situation and moving to another, constantly moving forward with a prize that when he gets, never quite satisfies. It's a high that he's constantly chasing and never achieves. And I think when I go back, or when I read other apocalyptic fiction in the future, that's going to be something I keep in my mind, is that perhaps we should always be thinking about how apocalyptic narratives represent personal apocalypses, as well as preoccupations with other ones. It'd be great to know what you think about all this. If you're tuning in and you've got some thoughts, we've got about 9 minutes left. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming up the rest of the festival today, what's going to be happening with our next End of the World Reading Club event, and then what we're going to do when we get to 2021, because we're going to change things up a little bit. So now is the time to drop something in the comments, all of you lovely viewers. If you're just happy to watch along, that's absolutely fine. And like I say, if you've got comments and you're coming to this afterwards and you're watching it back on YouTube, then drop them in below, because we'll continue this dialogue with you as we go on. Okay, I'm going to talk about those other things just to give you a chance to comment if you have got anything you want to say. And then I might leave at the very end with some final thoughts on this story. So, first thing to say is, Cosmere Festival is coming to a close for this year. We hope that you've managed to tune into some of our events, in particular our author talks. We've had some really interesting perspectives on end of the world narratives. Some of them have been quite dark. We were talking to Nikki Singer yesterday about the survival game, and also Ink by Alice Broadway is quite a dark story about control. And about how we navigate that world. But we're ending with some slightly lighter tones, I think, for our final two events. So if you're watching this live or you're watching this afternoon, we've got two events this evening. The first of which is we're going to hear from S.M. Wilson, the author of The Extinction Trials, which calls itself a mix of The Hunger Games and Jurassic Park. And then we're finishing the festival with what we're calling Writopolis TV. So this is the creators, R.J. Barker and Kit Power, who've invited Adrian Tchaikovsky and Jen Williams, the authors, to come and chat about the end of the world for an hour to finish our festival. And they're going to be doing it on our channels. So we're really looking forward to the whimsy that they're going to bring, particularly having started the day with a very naughty, twisted and dark end of the world narrative. Then we've got one more end of the world reading club, as I'm calling it, story, which we're going to be doing probably the end of November, maybe the beginning of December. I haven't quite figured it out. We're probably not going to do a Christmas one because everybody's going to be too busy. I think I'm going to be too busy. But we're going to, for our last one, and watch out for the dates for it, we're going to be talking about Rotherweird by Andrew Caldecott. This is a really, really great story, and it's the first part of a trilogy that I really want people to read, because I don't think I've had a conversation with it about it with anybody. No one I know in the real world has read it, and I think it's a really cool book and really interesting story. It's end of the worldy enough, I think, that we can get a lot from it. But also it's just a great story that I kind of want to talk about with you all. So watch out for that one. Like I say, it's going to be end of November, but may just tip into the beginning of December, so we get a December one out of the way. And then in 2021, we're going to probably switch it up and talk about some different stories. So our festival next year will be looking at the breadth and depth and the interesting narratives in science fiction fantasy. We're going to be looking at diverse voices, diverse stories. And there'll be information coming out next year about how you might be able to get involved in that in some way or another. But what we're going to probably do is start to talk about some of those authors and some of those stories in January and onwards. We might even rename this book club to not be the end of the world, just to delineate that change. And hopefully by 2021, we'll also not feel like it's the end of the world quite so much, and we'll be ready for other stories. So the first one of those will be in January. We haven't quite identified what that book is going to be yet, But there'll also be some other videos coming from us about some of those other stories. I think I might do one about the Poppy War because I read that quite recently and absolutely adored it. And I really want to talk about that story with you. So that might be a short form video that's coming a bit sooner. Also in the pipeline, I'm going to be looking back at some of the other books in my book collection. If you watched my review of all of my book count video, I'm going to be starting to go back and look at some of the years that are not represented in my book collection. I think I'm going to start in the year 2000. So if you've got stories that were published in that year, either in hardback or paperback, because I'm pretty chill about it, that you think I might not have heard of, maybe have only come to prominence since then, so would be hidden when I look through all the books that were published that year on the lists, then drop them in the comments. Tell us about them on social media, because I want to get your ideas on things that I might have missed. I'm pretty sure I own something like 6 books that were published in that year, so there is a whole iceberg to explore which I haven't got to. So as I promised, we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm just going to finish talking a little bit on my last thoughts about ice and where I think it maybe sits in the genre. And I don't quite know what to say, I suppose. As I said before, it's a singular story. It really is like nothing else I've ever read. I think if you want something to read which feels apocalyptic, you like that sense of dread, you like something that's quite wintry. A lot of reviews that I read were written by people who said that this is the thing that they read when it gets cold, maybe even in January. They like that chilly feeling while they're in a warm room and they can see the snow out the window. So if you want something that you've got to really think about and really dive into and consider and think about afterwards and reread, and it becomes something that becomes part of your rereading cycle, I would highly recommend this book. It's got a heck of a lot in there to talk about, and a heck of a lot in there to talk about which is really relevant to the world that we're living in today and the conversations that we're having today about toxic masculinity, about the way that women are presented in fiction, the way that online culture tends to deal with women and men and issues of control and identity. So there is loads in there for people that want to read those kind of stories and also like more fantastical ideas and concepts. It's something that I think I'll come back to. I think particularly in the context of the stories that we're going to look at for Cosmere 2021 for that year, I think this one will stay with me and I might end up rereading it, not in the context of the end of the world, but in the context of who stories are about, who is writing stories, and which voices have shaped the genre that we love. We're probably going to finish a minute early. I think I've probably said enough about this story because I want you to go and read it. I want to get your perspectives. I don't think there's any right or wrong answers here. It's so odd. It's so much like a fever dream. There's so much going on in quite a slim volume that it's a personal experience. And I'd love to hear your personal experiences of it and continue this conversation afterwards. So the best way to do that is on our YouTube channel. You can go and like and subscribe if you want to do that over there. The other thing I want to point out, or 2 things I want to point out, the first of which is if you enjoy this content and you want to support it, if you want to help us pay for StreamYard, which is the service that allows us to beam this all over the internet and lots of channels at the same time, you can do that by donating to the Ko-Fi link, which is, I can't do my pointing, it's just there. You can go to that address and you can drop us a little bit of cash that just helps us pay for these services. And also, we're really grateful because these services have been supported as part of the festival program this year by the People's Meeple, which is Huddersfield's board game cafe. Now, they're going to be open for takeaway, hopefully, over this lockdown that is about to come in. but we highly recommend you go there if you love board games and you live anywhere near Huddersfield. They've got an incredible selection. They're incredibly generous with recommendations, talking about what they love. Great food. You can get yourself coffee, and we are incredibly grateful for their support for Cosmere Festival 2021. So we will see you for the next one, or for one of our festival events that's coming up later on today. As ever, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.